Hello, hello, hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. We are entering the final phase, but again, still just the beginning of conversations around who owns Black data. Mary Elliott is in the room, National Museum of African American History. Can we get a round of applause for the NMAC? And for Mary Elliott and her brilliant curation of the Slavery and Freedom exhibit. We really need to shout that out a lot. We are going to open up again in just a moment. Just again, the usual announcement, the B-side, Black Visual Culture Room, is around the corner in the Barber Room. If you have not gone in there, just kind of sit and enjoy the space and enjoy the moving images. Please go do check that out. Also, bathrooms are outside to the right as well, if you are looking for such things. We have the keynote this evening that is not located here. It is at Nomu Nomu, 709 Howard Street, with Dorothy Berry, Jennifer Morgan, Bilfina Yawan. So I hope that everybody will come join us. That is immediately after the session is closed today. It starts at 6 p.m. and after that there is a bombazo hosted and organized by Semilla Cultural. So hopefully folks will come and have a very grand time. We are going to begin this session with another offering from our poets of Ink, Sweat, and Tears, authors of Uprising and Resistance, and we are going to have something from Remi Graves.
Hi everyone, I hope you had a good break. I went and sat in the sun, which was really soothing and warmer than I expected, which is lovely. I'm really emotional, my heart's beating really fast. Coming from London, we were like, we're going to Baltimore, and I think none of us expected the kind of amazing, beautiful work that we've seen and how much love, like obviously you're all academics, but there's so much love in the projects that you've done, and I really feel that. Oh, is that rude? I just mean, like, when you think of academia, you don't think of love, and here it's felt really loving. Okay. Wow. Thank you. The work that we were asked to do looking at the Lloyd's archive was kind of devoid of love in terms of the records that we saw. And I started to think about the archive of the sea, and the sea as a space with probably most of the stories that we can't access in terms of the people who are lost in the Middle Passage, and this poem came from that. It's an erasure poem. I won't read the two other ones, but I'd encourage you to go back to them if you want to. This one is called Gone. The sea has a thing on her lips. She's been longing, like us, for touch, company, some kind of honesty for once. She's been breathless, run to seed as if she too were whipped, wounded by her own complicity, slow moving pelagic thief, stretched between rotten pier and wretched plot. There's no such thing as good water in the toe of a saline taking. Taste her crystal gilt water body. Those of us gone to seed, crammed in the ship's hull, where nothing blossoms but the imaginary, burrow through damp wood to sky. How plant shoots root through soil for breath. We have been holding hands with each other, with our underwater hands, to learn of haptic frequencies, whilst the ochra seed, unflowered thing, dormant black bead of sweat past its time, makes soil of this drowned seabed. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. We start this session, the last session of full projects, and second to last one, where we get to have a whole full audience discussion soon. But we are heading into the panel on reparations. So I will call the projects up one by one. As you've seen, they will have their time, 5 minutes, to do their presentations, and then we'll open it up for a conversation with us all. And we are going to start with 10 Million Names.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kendra.
And I'm Vincent Brown.
It's really good to see you all today and to be part of this gathering. Thank you so much to Dr. Johnson, Dr. Webb, to Alex, Sasha, and the entire team for the invitation to be here today. So Dr. Brown and I are here as members of the Scholars Council. So it's a little different orientation, but Scholars Council, it helps to advise another project called 10 Million Names. And this project was launched about a little less than a year ago. I came into this project and I come to the questions that we are thinking about today really as a historian of African American genealogy. So most of my work for the last decade and a half, sadly, has been focused on the history of African American genealogy and also family history more broadly. I was going to say a couple words about that in terms of kind of why and how we as scholars engage with this kind of massive non-academic project. Starting with this quote I almost always begin with from the scholar E. Francis White, "Stories that we refuse to tell do matter." Okay, so I began going back and forth to Oklahoma in particular, as I was talking with Mary Elliott about our family roots in Oklahoma, with my grandmother about 20 years ago after my dad passed away, and collecting stories of her grandparents and their experiences in slavery and the post-emancipation period in the Black and Creek towns of Oklahoma. And this kind of gathering over time connected to a Back to Africa movement in 1913, in which a number of ex-slaves and their children, including my grandmother's grandparents and their kids, migrated to West Africa in 1913, 14, 15. And so we started doing these family reunions that kind of functioned as, more broadly, as kind of larger than family reunions. So descendants of the SAM movement that came together in 2007 and 2014 to mark the centennial of that movement. And those experiences led me to the project I'm writing now about a history of African American genealogy. And so part of what I care about in this work and in relation to 10 Million Names is how we do or do not memorialize the history of Black collectors and early Black historians' genealogical work that often wasn't either taken seriously or wasn't allowed to enter the academy. So thinking about big names like W.B. Du Bois, who in fact privately were doing all sorts of genealogical work. Carter Woodson would be another, but that work wasn't allowed to become scholarship or evidence per se, right? It was considered unbiased from the biased from the get-go, and therefore had to be kind of excised from their professional identities and work. Oops, I think I missed one. How do I go back? Ophelia settled Egypt. I was so glad to hear the reference to Egypt earlier this morning. And her work at Fisk would be another one of these individuals. So working with the early collectors like Ophelia settled Egypt and Du Bois and Woodson and a whole bunch of other people whose names we know far less, who were engaged in these early efforts before and after the Harlem Renaissance, before and after the Black Arts Movement. Oh. Okay. So on that note, I'm going to turn over in a second to Dr. Brown to say a bit more, but the 10 Million Names is aiming to collect the names of the roughly 10 million people who were enslaved in the land that became the U.S. between the 1520s and 1865. It is a massive, massive effort. The genealogy, it comes out of something called New England Historic Genealogical Society, which is a genealogical organization. And as a genealogical organization, it tends to be part of the genealogy industry, right, which is a $1 billion industry today, to say nothing of genetic genealogy, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about scale and about what it means to be part of something that's clearly a moving train, right? When I came onto this project, I saw there's a train that's about to leave the station. This would have taken off in the 1970s after Roots aired on ABC, or it could have taken off in the 1920s in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance, had there been the resources, the technology, and the kind of the collective will to make it happen, right? And so this project is joining a long long genealogical tradition that that we care very much about, and we're interested in the questions of scale and kind of the practicalities of making this happen. Okay, so two last things I'll say, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Brown. The large-scale effort of Black historians and genealogists working together, which is something that in the course of my work I'd never experienced before, that kind of collaboration between genealogists and historians. And the second is the possibilities of redirecting resources, especially to the preservation of Black records, HBCU archives, Fisk, Hampton, and others, ways that we can use and leverage kind of big projects to redirect real resources to long-standing collecting efforts.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, thank the organizers and thank all of you for coming. This has been already, for me, an incredibly important event to hear about all the work that you're doing, which is amazing, powerful, world-changing, emotionally impactful. I very much appreciate you. I don't have much time. All I want to do is tell you something you guys already know, for the most part, which is that for people whose families over long generations were commodified and whose relatives were commodities, one of the most important aspects of repair would be the knitting together of belonging and of family. Over and above, in my sense, any compensation for labor that was stolen and expropriated would be a sense of how we repair our sense of connectedness to each other. I got involved with the 10 Million Names Project because I had done, for a scholar named Richard Dunn, an online project to try and visualize the relationships between 7 intergenerational families on plantations in Virginia and Jamaica over the course of about 80 years. And I got to a point in the visualization project where I realized that the family tree was not really going to be something that was going to visualize these families, because obviously the form was something created for the succession of property or the succession of royalty, but for families who had been property, right, and who were routinely interfered with, the family tree wasn't going to be enough. And we reached a point where we couldn't quite visualize with the data we had what that was going to look like, and I was very happy to see Celia and Alex's project, which I think fulfilled the culmination of that reimagination of how one visualizes relationships over time in particular places. The 10 Million Names Project represents something on another scale, though. I have worked on a number of projects that have been bespoke, boutique, where I could imagine that my re-envisioning of what a family tree and what family relationships should look like could then be seeded out into the world and, right, remake the way we think about things. The 10 Million Names Project, as Dr. Field said, is a gigantic project that's part of a billion-dollar industry. It was a moving train that was leaving the station. And our role as historians was really like, I often say, it's kind of like we're hobos riding the rails, grabbing onto the train, seeing where it'll take us, and hoping not to lose a leg along the way. Right? That's our kind of role in this. But I'm hoping that at that scale, we can still, in some ways, insinuate some of our perspectives on the importance of knitting together belonging, of revisualizing family, of thinking through how that data can be made to do different kinds of things for us, even in a project of that scale where we are minor players, where we are not the initiators of the ideas, but we are constantly trying to redirect these resources toward visions of repair that we think are going to serve our communities. Absolutely. So you see Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who many of you will have heard of, Dr. Tavolia Glimpf, Dr. Carrie Greenidge, and Dr. Brandon Terry are with us on the Scholars Council. Thank you.
Next up, Black Louisiana History Incubators.
Yes. Hey, y'all. It's been great to be here with everybody and continue to talk about, this question about Black data. I thought it would be great to start off our presentation with a quote from Oh, we love touchscreen. From M. Jaquit Alexander, who's also a fellow with the DSL, and specifically from her book, Pedagogies of Crossing, thinking about Majuba, an expansive memory refusing to be housed in any single place, bound by limits of time, enclosed within the outlines of a map, encased in the physicality of body, or imprisoned as exhibit in a museum. Kind of just basically using this quote very much so as a stand-in on how we think about the work that we're doing within Louisiana, relating to the experiences of Black folk and the diaspora. I'm gonna pass it over to my lead over here real quick, Shanice.
Okay, and I'm gonna pass it over to Robin.
No, please cover Shanice. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of what Incubators is before Shanice, our amazing lab lead, and Feli, one of our newest members, get more into some of the work that we are doing. But the mission of Incubators is that we are dedicated to learning, educating, interpreting, and facilitating the stories of Black people of Louisiana through the digital humanities. We collaborate with academics, students, and the general public, and strive to supplement the voices of the African diaspora within Louisiana and beyond. And so our name and our work, right, considers the idea of incubation, right, nurturing and nourishing seeds and projects and people already in place. Should we go to the next? Here we go. And these are our team members, Shanice, Catherine Jones, who's not here, Nyla Williams, who's not here. They are both awesome undergrads at Xavier University in Louisiana, Feli Maynard, and myself, who is here today. And I want to shout out Maya Hogarth, our former lab lead.
Hello. So I'm going to talk about some of the past projects that we've been a part of. So I also want to say that in the past, we've been meeting primarily over Zoom because of the fact that Maya was based in Baltimore. However, currently, we meet in person as well as online, and we've been able to we say incubate, and incubate means a lot of many things. And so incubate can mean like to be in a space and kind of commune together. Incubate can mean to like create an event. It means many things. And so we're able to incubate in person currently. We are able to attend events. I participated in panels for one of our members' sorority events on Xavier's campus, which is an HBCU in Louisiana, New Orleans, on the continued legacy of book bannings in Louisiana, which was super insightful. And so one of the projects that we've been a part of is translating the Union. And so the Union is the first black daily newspaper in the entirety of the United States. It was originally published in French, so it's actually called L'Union. It was later translated, the later iteration is the New Orleans Tribune, which is continued today, which was then called the La Tribune de la Nouvelle-Orléans, and then later the New Orleans Tribune. That collection is housed, 17 issues of that collection are housed at the Tulane Special Collections, which is a very cold and weirdly exclusive space. And I would argue that they should be moved to another place close to campus, and I am looking at somebody right now. Yes. So what I did was I went about a few times, because you can only stay for about an hour. I went a few times through the special collections, and I digitized the issues. I used like Microsoft apps, and then would convert them to Adobe, and then later put them on Google. These issues are very big, and so they took me longer than expected to translate. I am a French student. I am a fourth-year PhD student, and I use I'm used to 19th century French register from literature, such as Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas, which are two folks who are both mentioned within this very black newspaper. And so on the front, there was coverage of news, updates from Civil War, translated speeches thank you for that. Translated speeches, and then on the back, there were, it was dedicated to advertisements for local spots that were black-owned, opera, because the black opera has a very huge tradition in Louisiana. I'm going to move on for the sake of time. We also participated in creating a community-centered African diasporic French class, which is called the African Diasporic French class. This is an additional way for New Orleans community to connect and come together. We connected via Zoom Saturday mornings and Sunday afternoons. This class was 1 hour of just a regular French class, and then 15 minutes of diasporic history. The class was free. It was catered towards New Orleans and Louisiana natives and residents, and emphasized speaking from day one. This class is very inspired by my work with African Diasporic Alliance and how they do radical curriculum building. There is a site you can go to. Oh, yes. Can you click it?
That's not the site?
No. Oh, it's not on there. Okay. Oh, there. So yeah, there is a site. You can go to it. There are my syllabus is there, the language learning resources, my Black Francophone playlist, which you can go to, and my diasporic supplementary materials. I'm going to move on for the sake of time. I do want to say that like all of the materials I had to build from scratch. This was a labor of love. I really can't wait to add the Haitian Revolutionary Fictions book as one of the supplementary materials. This was a very spur-of-the-moment project, and so, ran into a lot of, things. It was a pilot course, but I do want to shout out JMJ as well as my team for supporting my dreams and letting me run with crazy ideas. Last thing I want to say is that we played a role in promoting the film Forgotten Occupations, which was a screening that was on Xavier's campus. I just want to shout out all the members for participating, as well as folks who invited folks. There was a fantastic turnout despite initial expectations. We met with Mr. Leon Waters, who is with Louisiana Museum of African American History. We helped to make the flyer, make the brochure. We met across the world via Zoom over winter break. We were creating digital content, and Mr. Leon was able to fly out the director of the film, Alain Martin, as well as the family to be there, which was extremely impactful. I would suggest you all to check out the trailer, because the film gives the background and context into what is going on in Haiti right now. And America, as the capitalist imperial state, has had a stake in Haiti for over 100 years. So I just want to say that. And yeah, I'll back up.
Shanice does a lot, as y'all can tell. So shout out to Shanice. So I'm just gonna quickly say what we're in the process of doing. Our team has changed and transitioned a lot, so we're in the process of just figuring out how to work with each other. What are the ethics of working with new community partners? What are the ethics also of continuing to work with current community partners? How we can continue to support them while also understanding that we want to reach as far as we can. So as a new member, I'm an artist as well, and also work in archives. So my way of trying to figure out how to incorporate all the things that we do while also adding a visual element to it is figuring out how to incorporate old historical photography into the projects that we do. So how can people see themselves also in the past? Actually, I use a process from the 1850s, so thinking about how folks can see their ancestors and also move from that. And we're hoping to have this event in the spring with Xavier, having it be a very communal day, community, bring people together, and that's something that we feel like is very specific to Louisiana, so we want to keep that going. Yeah, we're working on our website as well, shout out for that, and also our Instagram and social media. So we have a lot of things brewing and coming, and we're very grateful to be here with y'all. Thank y'all.
Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on the gram.
Oh yeah, follow us on the gram.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, Color Conventions Project.
We got inspired and intimidated by the amazing and gorgeous presentations earlier, so we wanted to make sure that this presentation is the after lunch presentation that we sent you, right? So is this the after lunch? Because we went to work because y'all were for real this morning. Okay, all right, we want to make sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, with that, we're coming from the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State University, part of a larger team. We got 2 other members in the audience. Please wait. But I am a graduate student at the center, Courtney Murray, along with Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Gabrielle Foreman, and we are going to talk to you about the Color Conventions Project, which is housed within the Center for Black Digital Research. We have other projects, Douglas Day and the Black Women's Organizing Archive, but we're going to talk about this original one that has been alive for over a decade. So here we go. All right, and we're going to speak a bit today about how CCP helped in the past, present, future for us to center our type of reparative work, and that goes into our motto, dig black or dig black. Meaning we digitize Black records, excavate Black histories, dignify Black scholarship, and love Black people. And so this is what we do at the CBDR. And so today, we're going to start with project principles because we took a lot of time in the past and now getting these together because it helps guide our work and how we deal with our audiences and people who want to use our data. And I want to first acknowledge, that our energy source where we are grounded in is social change work, organizations, and communities. We are proud to be an incubator genealogy stemming from the Jimenez Principles for Democratic Organizing in 1996. So we honor and thank these environmental justice activists and the many organizers of color who led this effort for their example and for their work. And we also emulate the collective organizing of the Color Conventions movement itself through these principles. These principles keep us and our audiences accountable for how we engage in what we do with this Black history. In general, we have 5 principles that assert we follow in the footsteps of the Color Conventions, center Black communities, Black intellectual production, Black labor and pay, and affirm that Black organizing and humanity do exist in spaces that often try to silence those voices, such as archives, data, and history. And so for this conversation, I specifically highlight our principle 2, that is about affirming the historical legacy of Black women's organizing and labor, which we really try to do in our projects and the work that we do at the center. And our principle 5, that we also affirm the role of Black people as data creators. We recognize data's violence and erasure of Black lives and communities historically, and seek to name Black people and communities as an affirmation of the Black humanity inherent in Black data and creation. Okay, I'll pass it to Dr. Summer Hamilton to talk about how we change this into a center from a project.
Good afternoon. So with Dig Black principles, as Courtney just talked about, we had our Color Conventions principles, and the Dig Black principles help to extend those principles to cover a center, to cover our other projects, so BWOA and Douglas Day and our initiatives. And so these principles, when I was thinking about like how do these principles influence or shape, especially our work with data, since that's what we're talking about today, and I thought about how they influenced me in coming to the project. So I came to the project, so prior to my doctoral work in English, I was a systems analyst for 10 years. And so I've worked with data a lot. And so a lot of things when we think about data, a lot of verbs that we use. Like we think we store data, we track data, we analyze data. But what the principles help me to do is also to care for data. And so that's not a word that I had ever used before when thinking about data. So to care about data, but also to care for. And when you think about caring for something, it's like you engage actively, you protect it, you dote upon it, right? So you don't let anybody mess with it if you care for it. And so if we're thinking about Black data, how do we care for Black data? And so that's what the principles do. So like, I want to just point out really the kind of the same ones that Courtney talked about, the centrality of women in our work, and also, I don't know if we can go back. Okay, we'll stop there. I don't know how to go back, hold on. Okay, there we go. So yes, with the principle 3 is about the centrality of women, and then principle 4 is about data itself and how we refuse to traffic in disembodied data and when we are working with data. And so one of the ways that we can see that coming, and this can't see as well on this slide. I think it's a little blurry, but I'll tell you what it says. So on this slide, to the left, when we are working with data, we are actively restoring and recovering the role of women in the convention work that's been erased. And so this means that we build into our processes, into our transcription work, processes that find these women's names, but also find the unnamed women and still can include them in our data set so that now they will forevermore be a part of that history that they were once erased from. Also, our principles come into play in terms of our partners. So any memorandum of understanding incorporates our principles. So if someone's going to work with us or work with our data, they have to agree that they will also abide by these principles, as well as when people come to our website to use our data, they also have to click in and agree that they will abide by these principles. And now I will give it to Courtney, who'll talk a little bit more about the who.
Yes, the who of our work ranges across a lot of different people, and we still try to follow what the CCM movement was about by doing a horizontally collaboration alongside interdisciplinary scholars, the public, librarians, teachers, undergraduate and graduate students, and professors to find, submit, and process documents that include or mention color conventions. And as you can see, we have grown since 2012 to include satellite partners, teaching and arts partners, and graduate students, undergrads across 70 majors and minors and transcribers. I think we're across 6 institutions as of right now. So it's pretty big and a lot of work to be done. I'll pass it to Dr. Foreman about the history of this stuff.
So we're a team of 45 right now across 6 institutions. We're a team of 45 right now across 6 institutions. I want to start by thanking the organizers for this reparative space, for the repairing work of this quilted collective. This is an offering of reparation. It's altar work, as was said earlier. It's like lost and lost archives. It's like historical and spiritual recovery. And we just want to honor the people who organized and brought us together today to say that first. Thank you. We're going to talk for just a quick minute, not only about the who, because there's been iterations of large groups for over 12 years now, but also about the convention movement and the history itself. We'll do this quickly. I love this picture because it's really history from behind, history from below. We don't only focus on the delegates who are listed in the records in the archives, but we ask who was in the room and who got them to be in the room. So if women aren't in actually the records, we know that they were building the infrastructure. So we ask the critical questions about where do we find them, and then we do, right? And so all of us in this room know, right, that the records don't show us the humanity or the collective of people who were actually in the room at one time. So if you look at the records, you don't see the women who are here, the children who are here, the children who are moving out of their beds for the boarding houses when hundreds of people are coming into conventions, which began in 1830 and moved through the 1890s. 70 years of organizing for multi-day conventions that are talking about economic and labor justice, about educational access, about freedom from state-sanctioned violence, and also about freedom from white control. These are black-led movements, right? This is the history we know. Generally, we see the black person here, right? Purvis in the middle, right? Not even really sort of black at a distance, right? And instead, again, they organized against slavery, but for voting and political rights and jury rights in these multi-day conventions. And they met in the spaces of power and in the AME churches, right? So in the courthouses and in the legislative gatherings physically, right? But also in places like this, but also in churches and outside groups. Frederick Douglass attended scores of conventions over 40 years. From 43 to 83, he was, this is before he wrote the first narrative in 45, all right? We usually are seeing him in relationship to white abolitionists, even in David Blight's last book, right? The reviews talk about the white circuits of influence and networks, but he's in conversation for 40 years, right, with black people, who are involved in movement making and institution building of Black institutions like colleges and also newspapers and institutions. John Mercer Langston and his brother Charles participate in scores of conventions, more than 25 in total. Here you see collective writing signed in behalf of the convention, right, Charles Langston. So we have this individual model of writing, right, that we see that comes out of the slave narrative. Black people are writing in collectives, right? When we see Henry Highland Garnett's 1843 address to the slaves, he didn't write that. He wrote it in a group, in a collective, and refused to publish it until it got the actual imprimatur of a collective, right? He brought it back. We say he wrote it, he didn't write it by himself. So let's think about what it means to have a history and a genealogy of collective writing that isn't interested in individual escape, isn't interested in individual freedom, is interested in collective freedom, right? And acting collectively to enact that freedom. All right, John Mercer Langston and Charles Langston pass that on. Langston uses name, right? His grandfather is Charles Langston at these conventions. Again, John Mercer Langston goes to his first convention at 19 as a teenager, right? Here is Othello Burghardt sitting with the stars of 19th century activism, feeling small, I'm sure, right? Like, what? I'm up here with, right? Like Frederick Douglass and William Cooper Nell and, right? Like, I mean, these are, you know, Pennington, Charles Ray, William Allen, Alexander Crummell, 19th century people know these names. Othello Burghardt is like, I'm sitting next to Jessica Marie Johnson up in here, right? Right? But he goes on to be W.E.B. Du Bois's grandfather, right? And Du Bois lives with him when he is young as well. So we see these genealogies of organizing, genealogies of activism as well. This, I hope, is going to do its thing. Please do your thing. If you look at these conventions, this is supposed to lay out. So you would see if this slide wanted to work, because David doesn't always do that, right? That it will peak in 1860. So we had only 12 national conventions and books that ended in 1860, right? But when we started doing this work and making them freely and fully available, searchable, transcribable right online, we see that the rest of the slide that's not showing up, peaks in the 1860s, right? Yes? What? Oh, peaks in the 1860s. Right? Oh, and if you actually hit the button, it works too. All right. Okay. All right. When 4 million previously enslaved people are meeting with those who, even in New Orleans before the Civil War is over, right? Weeks after, right, the freedom of New Orleans, are meeting in conventions as well. We have created these digital records, and Summer's going to talk about this quickly. We have arts partnerships and other things that we may not get a chance to talk about, but we wanted to highlight a couple of them.
So I'll just click through these quickly just to let you know what happens with the data once we have it. Once we process it, we take the metadata, we take the digital records, and we upload this information to our site, which can be visited, you guys can visit. We also have transcription. This is an example of the very first transcription. We have been doing transcription to Douglass Day since then for a number of years. I don't know how many years, for 7 years. And so then we have these available as well with the records so that they're now searchable. We also have them where they're separated by, you can look by year, by city, by state. Also, we take these and turn them into, is this an example of the digital curriculum? We also have digital exhibits. We also have curriculum in classrooms, K through 12, college classes. We also, I skipped a part.
I think this is the older one, so we're going to have to.
Oh, okay. So that is what we do with the data. Not sure what is next. It's not. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
We got to go? Okay. We've got some murals. Let me hold of that. Keep on going. We've got initiatives on Marianne Shakari and Frances Harper coming up. They include digital exhibits, murals, poets responding, Douglass Day, academic symposiums. We think of ourselves as an incubator and pipeline project. The how we do what we do and who we include is as important as the content. And we get that because we try to be in conversation and inspired by y'all. Thank you.
Next up is Kinfolkology.
Okay, in true millennial fashion, I'm going to reference my phone as I speak. I want to begin by thanking the conveners of this conference, especially Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, for the invitation to appear here. As I'll explain, Kinfolkology is only about a year old, and so it's a tremendous honor to be here with you and to learn from all of your work. So my name is Jenny Williams, and I am co-founder, along with Yola Dance, whom I will tell you more about in just a moment, of Kinfolkology. I'm also a postdoc at UVA, and I focus on the coastwise traffic of enslaved persons to New Orleans in the antebellum era. And with that said, I'm going to sort of tell you the origin story of Kinfolkology, because it's become the best way to explain what we do and why we do it the way we do it. So in grad school, I had no idea what I was doing when I got there, which was here at Johns Hopkins. I could admit that now. And I knew I was interested in doing history that was useful not only to scholars, but to the public. And when I was introduced to records of the coastwise traffic, which are manifests that list enslaved people's names, I was blown away by the scale of the records and also how many names there were. It was apparent from the beginning that these were individuals who were family members and ancestors, and I decided I would build a database of all of them. I will be honest, I had no business deciding I knew how to build a database. I had never built a database. But yeah, 5 years later, there was a database called Oceans of Kinfolk, which was launched at the Slave Voyages Project in January of 2021. And I, at the time, having finished my PhD, accepted a position as co-editor of the Slave Voyages Project. When Oceans of Kinfolk was published, I think I anticipated feeling proud. Certainly I thought I would be pleased that the process of building it was done. But I actually found that I had very deep reservations and almost a sense of regret. And I think this is because, in some ways, my graduate education kind of began when it was supposed to be ending. And by that, I mean it began when Dr. Johnson sat me down and asked me a whole bunch of questions that I should have been asking all along, but was not asking. So for example, to whom is this work accountable? And also, you're doing work in New Orleans. Who have you talked to in New Orleans? Have you talked to local scholars or local knowledge keepers? Ultimately, she was asking me, who owns Black data, Jenny? And I did not have answers at the time. But by the time Oceans of Kinfolk came out, I was very much concerned with these same questions. This was distressing to feel this way, but even more distressing was probably the realization that in accepting a position at Slave Voyages, I had joined a project that actually relied on the same model I had used to build Oceans of Kinfolk. And so what this meant was that if I wanted to learn to do the work differently, I was not going to learn it there. And I have been shy about stating that in the past, but at this point, I think it's worth stating plainly. It was clear that instead I would have to learn, that I wanted to learn from scholars like Dr. Johnson and from so many of the scholars in this room who actually have been doing the work differently for a very long time. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for that work while I can. So about a year ago, I resigned from Slave Voyages and requested that the first edition of Oceans of Kinfolk be removed from the site. That request has been denied, I will say, has been refused. However, I made the request for two reasons. One is I wanted to revise the data itself. I was not yet as good at reading the documents as I am now. But more importantly, I wanted to do a new project that Oceans of Kinfolk would be just part of and that I would be just part of. And so at this point, I get to stop talking about myself and instead start talking about us, by which I mean about Kinfolkology and what we do. So this includes Sydney Howard, who is he? Please. Sydney Howard, who is an undergrad at George Mason and who I have learned will always ask, who is this project for anyway? And then she will wait for you to answer. About Breeze Doe, a PhD student in anthropology at UVA, who is afraid of absolutely nothing and no one, and who is as eager to inform you of your foolishness as she is to extend grace in its wake. About Zaria Elfil, a PhD student at the University of Chicago, who is hands down the most professional human being I've ever met, and who approaches the work with such steady devotion. And then there's John Baines and the newest member of our team, Marvin Aviles, who is here, who are essentially the data scientists who make our dreams come true. And I wish I could introduce you to our entire team of advisors, but I only have 5 minutes, so instead I need to publicly thank and acknowledge Dr. Edward Baptist at Cornell and Dr. Johnson, both of whom have believed in this project probably before I did. Lastly, but not least, I need to tell you about Yola Dance. So about this time a year ago, I drove up to Baltimore and asked Dr. Johnson, describe this project. I showed her a dinky PowerPoint, essentially, and said, clearly I can't run this by myself. I need a co-pilot who has experience and knowledge in the things that I lacked. She told me she had the perfect person, but that person was way too busy for me. So I begged. And eventually she agreed to call Yola Dance. And Yola is the co-pilot I could not even have dreamed of. She has been at the intersection of public history and descendant engagement for over 20 years. She is now president and CEO of Montpelier. And in addition to that, in her free time, she is a doctoral candidate at Howard University. Not only that, it was clear from our first conversation that Yola and I needed to work together because unbeknownst to me, and maybe even to you, to Dr. Johnson, I'm not sure, Yola most likely has an ancestor in the Oceans of Kinfolk database. So yes, I could not have asked for a better partner in this work. And while I wish you all could have met Yola today, she is sick because she tries to do too damn much all the time. So Yola, if you're watching this, which you probably are, take a nap, maybe? Okay, that stated, Kinfolkology has two broad objectives, which are, you might have guessed, data and descendant engagement. And the way we integrate these objectives sort of into one is through the model of structural parity, which was originally outlined by the Montpelier Descendants Committee, some of you all might be familiar with. But essentially, structural parity equates to shared authority. And so how does this look? How do you integrate descendant engagement and data through structural parity? Well, we're figuring that out, I'll be honest. We're only a year old, but I can tell you some of the changes we are already making to sort of signal what our priorities are. So right now, Kinfolkology has two databases, Oceans of Kinfolk, which I already described, but includes, maybe I didn't actually, sorry. Oceans of Kinfolk includes 63,000 enslaved individuals who were trafficked to New Orleans before the Civil War. Louisiana Kindred is a developing database of the sales of enslaved persons in New Orleans. And Dr. Roseanne Adderley is here, and we are super excited that her students, under her supervision, are working on Louisiana Kindred. And so already in these two databases, if you explore them in your free time, you will see some changes that signal our priorities in terms of humanizing and contextualizing the data. But I'll be honest, those are preliminary changes because the most significant work remains to be done because we are in the process of building relationships with the communities represented in the data. So in the next year or so, we will have 6 state gatherings, mostly in the East Coast, starting in Virginia on May 5th. You all are not actually all invited because it's limited capacity. But we will be working and building Kinfolkology from the ground up with these community partners, including building a new database is where I'll end, which is called Remembering Kinfolk, in which we seek to explore the idea that maybe data doesn't have to be, in the context of slavery studies, exclusively the data of violence and the data of death and the data of enslavers' records. So what would it look like to build a database instead of oral histories, family photos, art? And so that's something we're designing with descendant communities. And the last thing I'll say, I lied when I said it was the last thing before. The last thing I'll say, because this is a panel on reparations, is that in addition to structural parity, Kinfolkology, our core commitment is to connecting data to efforts on behalf of justice and redress. Hopefully we'll have more time to talk about that in the panel. Thank you.
Smallpox and slavery. Come on up. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just say this room looks so different than the kinds of rooms I'm usually in as an early modernist? In a good way, in a really, really beautiful way. It's good to be here. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so let's get situated. I am Dr. Elise Mitchell, the compiler, editor, curator, I haven't decided on my terms yet, of Smallpox and Slavery in the Early Modern Atlantic World, A Digital History, which is a still developing digital history project. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you to the organizers of this symposium. I'm truly honored to be here, and I'm learning so much from all of you. So I'm going to share a bit with you about smallpox and slavery and think through some of its implications for how we conceive of reparations. So Smallpox and Slavery in the Early Modern Atlantic World, A Digital History, is a digital history project supported by the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective, thank you to Alex Hill, and yes, and Princeton Center for the Digital Humanities, including some folks who maybe used to be at Princeton and seem not to be anymore, but have really helped me out. Later this year, the project will launch at Swarthmore College, where I will join the faculty and begin involving students in the project. Smallpox and Slavery will eventually contain a searchable database of over 600 smallpox outbreaks that affected enslaved Africans in the Atlantic world, primarily in West and West Central Africa, and the Spanish, French, Portuguese, and British territories in the greater Caribbean region, so around the Caribbean basin and the islands and along the coasts, between the years of 1500 and 1800. Every outbreak in the database is accompanied by a narrative description and a bibliographical note that describes the manuscript and print archival sources and sources in the historiography that are useful to understanding these outbreaks. In addition to the database, the project will also include time-lapse dot and heat maps of the database, timelines of key events in the history of smallpox and slavery, and short essays accessibly narrating the history of smallpox and slavery, and a glossary of Caribbean and African terms related to the history of healing and disease. I began making this database in 2015 as a way to keep track of my dissertation research. After finding that this information was useful to some other researchers, I decided to revise the database and make it available to scholars and students, especially available to folks in the Caribbean who may have trouble accessing some of the archives that I access to be able to retrieve this information. I believe it's necessary that we think about the histories of smallpox and slavery together because these histories are deeply intertwined. So please allow me to share a little bit of the historical context with you. So in 1518, the first smallpox epidemics in the Americas occur, and the direct transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas by way of the Caribbean begins. In the 1600s, the Iberian transatlantic slave trade became the primary vector for the spread of smallpox in the Atlantic world. In the 1600s and 1700s, colonies throughout the Americas began enforcing quarantine policies against slave ships carrying enslaved people reputedly infected with smallpox. So in some cases, people who weren't even sick with smallpox were quarantined. This is a non-exhaustive list of some of the quarantine policies that were passed that targeted slave ships explicitly. One example of a place where enslaved people were quarantined from as early as the 1620s is the Isla de Cabras off the coast of Puerto Rico. The island is now connected to Puerto Rico with landfill. Enslaved Africans were quarantined here from the 1620s all the way through the turn of the 19th century. But today, the Isla de Cabras is actually a space where a lot of Puerto Ricans engage in recreation, and some people even believe in there being curative
qualities to having a sea bath there or breathing the sea air there. So the space itself has actually transformed significantly in terms of meaning to Afro-descendant communities there. In the 1700s, the expansion of the French and British slave trades increased the number of smallpox outbreaks and epidemics along the West African coast and throughout the Caribbean and wider Americas. And in the 1700s, Europeans learned about smallpox inoculation from West Africans and Arabs and began using the practice to unsuccessfully quell the spread of smallpox in the slave trade and on plantations. 1798, an Englishman named Edward Jenner develops the first cowpox vaccine, or one of the first cowpox vaccines. And between 1803 and 1806, the Balmis expedition spreads the cowpox vaccine throughout the world, transforming how smallpox is addressed. And in 1807, the British abolished the slave trade, resulting in a decrease in slave trading to some regions and international and inter-imperial reforms designed to prevent disease outbreaks on slave ships. So I'm going to show you a somewhat clunky map of some of my database. So this is a map that I created in 2020 before receiving my PhD using a program called CartoDB. At the time, it was useful to map the database because it further revealed the spatial overlap of smallpox outbreaks in the slave trade. Doesn't the map that I just showed you kind of remind you of the map of the slave trade in terms of the areas that are lighting up? However, this map has tremendous limitations, which I'm happy to discuss one-on-one. But the main limitation is that it can't account for a large swath of the outbreaks in my database because they occurred on slave ships during Atlantic and intra-American crossings. So right now I'm working on transforming the database and maps, transforming my research tools into a digital project, and reckoning with the differences between the two. Part of that transformation involves collaborations with developers at Performant to build maps that have dimmable regions and demonstrate the movement of ships with outbreaks on board. These maps can never tell the full story. Nevertheless, my hope is that accompanying descriptions of outbreaks, we can get closer to representing this violent history and enslaved people's deaf pursuits of survival and healing despite it. So to conclude, I want to encourage us to think about how the brief history that I just shared with you all can inform our calls for reparations in the present. Though the slave trade and slavery have long been abolished, descendants of enslaved people throughout the Americas are still disproportionately impacted by contagious disease epidemics and face tremendous barriers to access to health care, not only life-saving therapeutics, but also prophylaxis. In the US, for example, vaccination coverage remains significantly lower among people of African descent, even though we seem to be kind of the ones who introduced it to a lot of folks around the world. And I've argued in multiple publications that calls for reparations must always include calls for public health, medical, and community healing initiatives that prioritize the holistic well-being of Black people and are not contingent on or embedded within anti-Black organizations and institutions up to and including the state in some cases. Because as we know, Black people in the US continue to be disproportionately exposed to environmental health hazards such as air and water pollution and the changing climate, things that our government continues to fail to address. Hazards of ongoing pandemics such as HIV/AIDS and COVID-19, which our government also continues to fail to address. And the numerous psychological and physical hazards associated with displacement, such as the consequences of policing associated with gentrification, which are a public health issue, and the consequences associated with border policing, which I would argue are also a public health issue. The list goes on, and a full list would be a litany too long for this presentation, so I'll leave us here with this question. Thank you all so much. Sorry if that was a little fast.
Please welcome the Texas Freedom Colonies Project.
Hello, hello, good afternoon. And everyone answers back. I love this crowd. Hey, it's not always true that that happens. So I'm Dr. Andrea Roberts, and I'm at the University of Virginia. I'm the founder of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, and also director of the Center for Cultural Landscapes. And most importantly, those are my great, and great-grandparents. So every time I do this presentation, I invoke those ancestors because the work is for them and it is of them. So I mentioned the Texas Freedom Colonies. What is it? It was founded in 2014 as part of my doctoral research. It is about preservation, education, service, and transformation. It is a project that is rooted and propagates what I call a place preservation model. And that's about connecting, collecting, countermapping, and co-creating research. That is connecting and collecting, place-making, mapping stories, and pictures, images, ephemera about the origination of place intentionally by Black folks, and then using that data to countermap and steward in partnership with those communities, and finally to then access and use that data to co-create research and solutions in cooperation with these communities and their descendants. So the project truly is not just one in which we're collecting and mapping and spatializing data, but it's really about helping people manifest a collectivity, a personal rootedness, and their commitments to a larger descendant community justice movement. This is fueled by strategic deployment of our stories and our memories. I treat knowledge forms such as oral tradition, story, and performance as planning and historic preservation data, enabling researchers, practitioners, and descendants to collaboratively visualize and reconstruct Black places through the Atlas, which I deem a Black world of free Black worlds. So more about the project itself. Oh, and of course, importantly, descendants, and in the middle, the more than 21 plus students that I've worked with in 2 different institutions over the past 7 years to actually make this project possible. So what's a freedom colony? So freedom colonies are historic African-American settlements founded 1865 to 1930. They're known by many names in different states. Freedom colonies is but one term. We're used to hearing freedmen's towns, free towns, freed people communities. They go by many different names. What ties them together is their intentionality and the accumulation of land either through tenancy in common or ownership. In Texas, in the 1870s, we had about 2.5% of all land, farmland, owned by Black folks. By the time we get to 1910, we're looking at us owning 1/3 of all land in Texas, all farmland in Texas. So what we are doing in revisualizing this collectivity, this sense of Black sense of place, is visualizing what we have lost and what has been taken. And most importantly, these places do have a history that remains. It's in the churches, the schools that remain, but also in the commemorative acts and processes that occur. And why don't we see these more than 557 plus places in Texas anymore? Because of the many reasons you see here: population, racial loss through racial violence, great migration, land dispossession, infrastructure displacement, and so many more, unfortunately. But it was my encounter with a community in 2014 called Shankleville Community, who I've been working with and continue to work with in partnership ever since, that I saw an asset-based approach to reclamation, and that was really rooted in their creation story, their origin story, which is about 2 formerly enslaved Africans in Mississippi, one of whom was sold away to a master in Texas. That would be Winnie Shankle, and Jim Shankle, her husband, swam 3 great rivers to reunite with her at a spring in Deep East Texas. Now, yes, exactly, heart. Tenacity, determination, exactly. And this is a story that has, has resonances in many other stories of marriage in North Carolina and the Dismal Swamp and so many other places. But what's important about this story is that it is used as a mode of organization and getting people to return back to the place to engage in preservation. During the process of that, I met even more through snowball sampling, met lots of other community leaders. And those community leaders then led me to different places and tours and interviews where we found that there were more than 36 free Black places in this 2-county area. So I used that same method to expand and develop the Atlas, which is an online interactive space with both public data and community data to visualize these places. And I'm going rather quickly, I'm sorry, I'm gonna get there. And so this is but one example of the many stories that individuals, descendants have uploaded. And what's notable is the density of information in a small paragraph about the past and current history of the place. So what have we achieved? We're a model used by lots of other folks, but we have identified the location and stories of 526 places in Texas alone. So now we are on the road to doing this in more states, Texas, Virginia, and California, to trace that migratory story of place origination and making through the support of the Mellon Foundation, which is funding what we're calling outsider preservation. And it is where we'll be developing a new portal and communities of practice and a new preservation pedagogy to go with all this, and most importantly, grants to the descendants and artists themselves who are looking at new ways to commemorate and document place origination and reactivation. And finally, these are but some examples of us beginning to do that expansion work through an East-West meeting of descendants in Virginia, as well as a Mellon Roundtable, and we're working right now with a Rosenwald School doing some of that recovery documentation work with descendants in rural Virginia. And here's a QR code to learn more about the many projects that we have in process and that we'd love you to be a part of.
Last but not least, and then we'll get to have a little bit of a chat, Underwriting Souls.
Hey again, everybody. I just want to say it's this day has been truly the most incredible, the most inspiring experience. This working with, got to shout out my Black Beyond Data crew. Working with Dr. Jessica Johnson, working with Dr. Kim Gallen, working with Saeed, I hope he's still here, and Lauren Rubin has been the apex of my short career to this point. I'm Dr. Sasha White. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and history of medicine here at Johns Hopkins. This is soon to be Dr. P.R. Seth, graduate student here at Johns Hopkins. And we're going to talk to you about Underwriting Souls, a project that digitized the materials in the collection, the archives of Lloyd's of London, pertaining to the Atlantic slave trade. And we're going to go quickly through some of the aspects of it. Happy to chat about all of it, but I think we want to particularly focus on questions of repair and reparations in our presentation. So, firstly, this is us, PR and myself. And I also want to shout out Eliza Zimmerman, who was an undergraduate, now alum of Johns Hopkins, who also worked with us on this project, exploring explicitly the risk books from the Lloyd's archive. And I also want to give immense thanks to the team at Sheridan Libraries, Mark Sizik, Michelle Janowicki, Mark Patton, and Jessica Keys for all their work in building the infrastructure, developing the metadata systems and structures and collection structures that we needed and used for this project. And also, I want to thank our other interlocutors, our collaborators, especially across the Atlantic. In the middle here is Victoria Lane, the archivist of Lloyd's, who brought so many of us together and worked with us so closely. Also, Dr. Michael Ohajuru, who is a member of our advisory board. The timeline, woo-wee. Yep, that's it. The timeline, we wanted to think, I reached out to Lloyd's in the summer of 2021. After they had apologized for their historic role in Atlantic slavery, they were in the process of attempting to understand the materials within their own collections. And I reached out saying, ostensibly, hey, would you be interested in an academic project to digitize the materials in your archive and produce educational content, public educational content from these materials to explore these histories long been obscured, covered, closed off in most cases from the general public. And I also said, we don't want your money. We'll take money for the Mellon Foundation. We want academic freedom and separation of the financial and the research work, and the conclusions. And they said yes, ultimately. And after 3 months of negotiation, we developed a legal agreement that protected financial separation between us and Lloyd's, as well as the academic freedom of the project. And in the summer and autumn of 2022, PR and I spent numerous trips across the Atlantic doing this work and exploring resources and archives, not only at Lloyd's, but across the UK and the United States, as well as digital archives around the world. And also collaborated, of course, with the poets and artists that are here in Ink, Sweat, and Tears and Spread the Word to produce the volume that you've been hearing from, which was released in May of 2023. The objectives of the work were fundamentally both personal and central to this. Our goal was to digitize the collections of Lloyd's pertaining to the transatlantic slave trade and produce online educational materials, as well as produce artistic responses explicitly to the silences and the violences of the archive, to respond and resist those violences in particular ways. And you've heard the incredible results of that, as well as maintain the highest standards of ethical and historical research. Another objective was to engage in a transatlantic dialogue, a dialogue, especially in the UK, where the histories of slavery and the role of London, especially in the city of London, in that history of slavery has been obscured, has been erased, has been covered up, and those who talk about them are gaslit into suggesting that it's only a triumphalist history, it's only an emancipatory history that the British Empire has. This work sought to confound permanently those conclusions. The ethics and review of the project were also central. We worked with an advisory board that we built of British and Black British artists, activists, historians, public historians, researchers who oversaw every aspect of the project. We also received external peer review on all the material that's up on underwritingsouls.org. We wanted to make sure that there was no possibility of rejection, refutation, especially from a very aggressive British press. And we didn't get it, which was remarkable. We also have, you can study all of this in a 41-page single-spaced ethics and methods document that we have on the website. And the result in terms of, we can discuss the limits and possibilities of reparation, and the limits and possibilities of uncovering, bringing to light, one could say emancipating corporate archives on histories of slavery. But the result from our research, in no small part, was commitments of Lloyd's to invest £65 million in a number of diversity inclusion initiatives, as well as scholarship support and projects devoted to responding to this history.
So, hello everyone. So ultimately the work that Sasha and I have been doing over the last few years ultimately culminated in what you see here is underwritingsouls.org, which consists broadly of 9 digital exhibits, 8 of which are exclusively focused on thinking through questions around insurance in the slave trade, and in particular the financial practices that were developed within and through the Lloyd's market. A couple of things to note. One of the important things about Lloyd's, or one of the interesting kind of points about Lloyd's, is that it's not an insurance company, it's a market. That fundamentally this was a space that brought together merchants, brokers, underwriters, a whole host of folk together that funnel in their expertise and their lived experiences into particular calculations that ultimately result in the insurance of, or the insuring of slaving voyages. I'd say the kind of second part, and Sasha and I kind of think through this a lot, is that it's no coincidence that the growth and the expansion of Lloyd's as an institution very much runs parallel to the growth and the expansion of the British Empire more broadly. And so particularly when you're thinking about questions of reparations, right, it's not just this questions of overlapping histories, but also these overlapping institutions. And in particular, I think this is one of the things that we tried to highlight within these 8 digital exhibits. Along with these 8 digital exhibits, you can also see our entire kind of digitized corpus. So we have a whole host of materials that we digitized throughout this process. But in particular, these 8 digital exhibits are really kind of largely centered around really kind of 3 documents in particular. One is a full-length insurance policy for the Guipuzcoa. It's a Spanish vessel, or leaving, it's a Spanish vessel sailing from Liverpool to the Gold Coast and then to the island of Cuba. I believe there are less than 10, don't quote me on this, but I believe there are less than 10 full-length insurance policies for slaving voyages that are formally archived, as well as 2 risk books. One that is belonged to a man named Horatio Clagett, who's actually originally from Maryland, as well as who we believe is likely a man named Solomon de Aguilar. And I believe, again, don't quote me on this, but roughly less than 10, less than 12 risk books that have been formally archived. And so we wanted to really kind of center these exhibits on these documents in particular, given the fact that, you know, documents like these aren't typically kind of available to the public. And finally, the last kind of exhibit, the 9th digital exhibit, is really kind of centered on the brilliant and beautiful work of some folk that you've actually had the privilege of hearing from throughout the day, a group of Black British poets and artists from Ink, Spread, and Tears and Spread the Word. And this kind of last exhibit really kind of creatively reintroduces the Lloyd's materials, really kind of in tandem with the work done by these brilliant kind of Black British artists and poets. Fundamentally, I think you can think about this exercise in a couple of different ways. One, you might think of it as, you know, a kind of exercise in critical fabulation, but I think the second hand, you know, I think, you know, some of my friends in the room are probably tired of me saying this all the time, but one of my favorite quotes is from Toni Morrison, where she says, there are certain traumas that are visited onto people so deep, so cruel, that only the writer can translate such sorrow into meaning and sharpen the moral imagination. And so I think, you know, this 9th exhibit was very much kind of a question or an exercise in thinking about, you know, what does it mean when historians, when sociologists, when anthropologists, when literary, you know, theorists and historians and, you know, artists kind of come together to really think through these questions around what does it mean to live, what does it mean to exist, what does it mean to be, what does it mean to breathe, and fundamentally, what does it mean to live? And with that, I will pass it over to Sasha. So
very quickly to close, I mean, empirically, some of the things that we found, we built so much on the work of digital humanities scholars in the UK, Catherine Hall, Nicholas Draper, and others, who've done work on the legacy of British slave ownership, as well as the work of Eric Williams and Charles Inakori, who first mentioned Lloyd's as a very likely place of centering the transatlantic slave trade and insurance. But what we found was deep, long connected networks of insurers who were not aloof businessmen in the city of London, but had actively engaged in the enslavement of people as ship captains previously, as owners and operators of slaving forts on the west coast of Africa, as plantation owners, as agents and slave owners in other spaces who brought back this knowledge of how to enslave people and made it central to their insurance practices. This is not the story of a distant London at a node before the triangle in the transatlantic slave trade, but actually a place that was envisioning systems of enslavement, practices of confinement, practices of violence before they were even occurring. And the work, we hope, is a testament to that, to the ancestors, and to those who suffered and survived through these processes. This, you don't have to look at closely, but this is an immense network of organizations and groups that were committed and engaged with us throughout this, and a network that we rely on very deeply and are so deeply thankful for. Lastly, the site Underwriting Souls is dedicated to Boyega Odebanjo, who's the editor of Uprising and Resistance, who sadly passed away last year. So we do this work in no small part to honor his memory. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to further questions and conversation.
Okay, how's everybody doing? How are you feeling? We're still here, we're making it. Todo bien? Okay. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll take a break and come back for a larger, full audience discussion with the conveners and also across various projects. But for folks who have burning questions, Kathy Hambrick, let's go.
My question is for Sasha.
Let me get.
I'm from a region up River Road that's known as the petrochemical corridor. We plan to look at Royal Dutch Shell or any of the other companies that have been involved in this
in the slave trade over the centuries?
Thanks. That's an incredible question. I think the nature of working and engaging with corporate archives is a complicated one. I think what we tried to do was present an ethical model to do so as we kind of developed this project where we didn't know what we were going to find and we didn't know the scale of what we were going to find. I know that there have been folks who've tried to work with Royal Dutch Shell and have not had success accessing these materials. And that's true for a number of other institutions. I think the work within the City of London is, we were one of a growing ecosystem of several projects that operated in different levels around these existing archives. But the figuring out ways to navigate, especially entities like Shell, is very, very complicated. And I would love to do that research in some respects. I haven't tried, but it's been, they're a particularly resistant institution.
She said, let's talk. Like that.
Do I need to stand up? First, I wanted to thank all of the folks who are out there collecting this data, digitizing it, making it accessible to a wider audience, that they don't have to be attached to the academy in any particular way, and the information isn't behind a paywall. Thank you for that tireless work. I appreciate it. The question is, I wanted to know if there's any organizations or any efforts that folks are aware of that are doing some reparative work around making genealogical data accessible for free to people who want to trace back their history. For example, making access to Ancestry.com free for people of African descent, since that was robbed from that population. Does anyone know of any efforts around that?
So this is a question that we get a lot for understandable reasons, because I think most of us, or probably all of us, would agree that it is a problem to put information about people who were commodified in life behind a paywall. At Kinfolkology, we are working with some of those records now that are behind various paywalls, but our intention is ultimately to shift stewardship of that information away from such organizations. And I'll be honest, it looks like there may be work that needs to be redone. But I also want to point out that I think one reason that Ancestry and similar sites exist is because the federal government did not deem what are public records significant enough to give them the attention they deserve. And so thinking about the theme of our panel, which is reparations, it seems logical to me that giving these records the attention and funding that they deserve given what they represent, which is billions of enslaved people, should be part of any reparations effort. So that's something that we're trying to articulate.
Does 10 Million Names want to either Kendra?
Yeah, I think I would second everything that Dr. Williams said, and I think there's also really, the reason we have the Scholars Council for 10 Million Names as well as the Genealogist Council is because there's like decisions every day and sometimes every hour around like what gets categorized as a quote unquote 10 million names database and therefore isn't behind a paywall, right? So if you have like the whole census from 1880, Alabama, there's going to be lots and lots of freed people in that census, right? But whether or not that whole database gets categorized in a certain way for the purposes of tracing people of African descent to their country, so you have kind of changing racial categories. Some people might appear one way in one census, another way in another census, and so dealing with all of that, it's really kind of fraught and complicated, especially within the larger genealogical industry.
Family Search does not charge anything Unlike Ancestry.com and many of the other platforms, Family Search, which is operated by the LDS Church, they say that they don't ever plan, well, ever is a long time, but never, ever is a long time, but currently they don't charge anything for access to their database, and they're very, very proactively looking to add any information about enslavement and African Americans.
We are going to just pause exactly here, because I think this is a really good place to take a quick 5 minutes, a quick 5-minute break, water yourselves, coffee yourselves, and then let's come back and keep exactly this very conversation going. If you've had burning questions across the panels, if you've had burning questions for other panels, let's bring them back for our last bit. Where do we go from here? Can we have a huge round of applause for everybody who did reparations today? Thank you so much. See you in 5 minutes. How many minutes? 5. How many minutes? 5. Do you believe in Black freedom?